what happens in an empire is that absent a strong leader and a strong group of capable subordinates around him, you not only lose the control over your distant provinces and the other realms of the empire, but things begin to fall apart at home as well.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius, and Germanicus is here. We have our cup of wine. It's very cold. It's icy cold. The centurions and their families have gone home. We're hoping for more theater tonight. The pandemic's gone, but there's been no announcement all week because we've had such wretched weather. It's a presumption there won't be much of an audience, and our theaters must make money. We're not Rome giving money away. Germanicus and I have a great deal to discuss because of the events of these last days. We now have a little clarity about the 21st century. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. As I understand it right now, the European leadership, and that would begin with Mr. Macron and include Schulz of Germany. I did not see I didn't see all the names that are coming. Certainly Starmer will be there from Britain. Giorgia Meloni is not a name I saw, but there's Wilders from Netherlands, and there are Gonzalez. Well, let's just say the European leadership will meet in Paris in what they call an emergency meeting. And the topic is the presentation by the Vice President, Mr. Vance, at the Munich Security Conference that took the last 3 days, 14, 15, and 16. And the speech by Mr. Vance, which I recommend to everyone, identified Germany and Britain in particular, and Scotland too, as suppressing free speech, as being unacceptable to Americans. The response from the audience was that Mr. Vance is unacceptable and the Trump administration is unacceptable, and we came here to hear your plan about getting us out of trouble in Ukraine, and instead you're interfering in our election. The German election is in 1 week on the 23rd, and the party that Mr. Vance named in particular, AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, led by Alice Weidel, a 46-year-old former banker. She worked for Goldman Sachs. She lives in Switzerland openly with a wife from Sri Lanka, and she very carefully speaks every night about what she intends to do when she's chancellor, which is to deport the people who came to Germany between 2015 and 2022. Deport them. And she's going to do that because she says Germany's not safe and we've lost control of our streets. There was an incident in Munich last week that illustrated perfectly what she's talking about. An Afghan refugee who had applied for asylum and was rejected deliberately drove a vehicle into the back of a large crowd. Right now, there are 2 dead out of the crowd, many injured. One of them is a 2-year-old female. And Germany is enraged. At the same time, the leadership in Germany is enraged by Mr. Vance's remarks. The German Defense Minister Pistorius has condemned the Vice President of the United States. The ironies here are so thick, I'm racing through this. Macron says an emergency meeting. In the meantime, we're told that immediately Mr. Trump will travel to Riyadh to meet with Vladimir Putin to discuss ending the Ukraine conflict and other matters having to do with what Mr. Trump calls denuking. There's also the matter of trade and sanctions and embargoes. Mr. Rubio, the Secretary of State, and others of the Trump administration, National Security Advisor, are already meeting with or have already met with Lavrov and a team from Moscow. So this will be a bilateral confrontation between the two Cold Warriors of the 20th century looking to denuke in the 21st century. Of note, and I'll end here, Mr. Zelensky is not invited to the Riyadh meeting. To my knowledge, none of the European leaders are invited to the Riyadh meeting. This is what you outlined last week. And review it for us, Germanicus. This is Alexander meeting with Napoleon in the middle of a river on a raft to decide the fate of Europe. Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. The uh, the larger trajectory of the U.S. relationship with Europe since 1945, that's 80 years, is one of gradual divergence, not convergence. And Europe has evolved in a different direction. And actually, one could see that quite clearly when the EU was stood up around 1990. It became a real thing, a real governing body. And looking at its approach to life and society, as well as the role of the state in society and many other things that politics need to attend to. It was clearly moving in a different direction than the United States. And you have cultural evolution like this. It happened in Rome, as we've seen. I mean, Rome naturally evolved from a republic to an empire, and then the empire evolved into several phases and was a completely different kind of of culture and a different kind of world spirit in late Rome than it had been at the time of Augustus. It would be unrecognizable to either someone in the late empire or someone in the early empire. They would not recognize each other. This is happening now with Europe, and frankly, the American approach to Europe has assumed that Europe would remain as culturally dependent on the U.S. as it has been militarily dependent, and yet that ended with the end of the Cold War. And so Europe has really drifted in a different direction, and it has at the same time become weaker. When Europe was in the middle of the Cold War, NATO's 13 nations, remember, that's all it was back in the Cold War. They stood shoulder to shoulder, and Europe's armed forces were very impressive, especially the West German army. It was very powerful. And now there is no such thing as effective military force anywhere to be found in the EU. And so this drift has gone relatively unremarked on, in large part because the elites in the U.S. still were resonant to what was going on in Europe, but that has all this has been ripped away. The curtain has been torn, and the utility of the vice president's speech was to make all this clear. He was the bearer of the apocalypse. He pulled away the curtain, and what we see are two different places now, and they have very little in common. And the Europeans, rather than saying, "Uh-oh, do we want to maintain this relationship? What do we need to do to make this work?" are suddenly becoming aware, even though they won't yet confess to it, that they're their own place and they have to go their own way. And in contrast, because you brought up Napoleon and Alexander at Tilsit, the U.S. now has, in some ways, more in common with Russia than it does with Europe, in the sense that both Russia and the U.S. are great powers that still think in great power terms. And the U.S. is now far more warlike and focused on great power exercise, even than it was in the Cold War. And so there's a lot that Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump have to talk about. And again, looking at Napoleon in 1809, you can see that he had created a totally subservient Europe, the Confederation of the Rhine. You had the Kingdom of Italy. He'd gone into Spain and tried to put his brother on the throne. It was a total Napoleonic operation. And in many ways, Europe today, during this war with Ukraine, was a vassal operation. And I think that the great thing about the recent election and the enunciation of a new direction for the U.S. is that it has brought all this,
1 minute, 1 minute.
brought all this into sharp focus. And so the actual shift that has occurred in terms of worldview is in many ways more important than whatever events or policy decisions are going to be made. This represents a break, a big break.
Germanicus, simple, straightforward. Does Europe believe it, that we've left them? Do they understand they're home alone now?
They haven't, it hasn't sunk in yet, but they've done it. I mean, they're the ones who are forging the break, as it were. I mean, it's a mixed metaphor, but yes, they are doing it. And at some point, they will have to realize that they've created a new world for themselves. They can't sustain the happy, comfortable vassal status that they had for 80 years.
The events of Washington, D.C., a city I've never lived in, I've visited, and I've never felt comfortable, quite different dimensions and pace than I'm used to in Manhattan. And now that I'm not in Manhattan or Washington anymore, I puzzle about major American cities and how they get on. Right now, Washington is not getting on because we're told again and again, this is not our opinion, this is the headlines, that DOGE is a constitutional crisis. I leave that alone because Germanicus and I are not here to entertain constitutional crises. What we're looking at is DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. Mr. Trump said during the campaign, this is what I'm going to do. And he turned to Elon Musk. Elon Musk said, this is what I'm going to do. There's any number of younger people, the kind that are hired by Tesla and SpaceX, with their laptops going from department to department in the executive branch and identifying redundancies or inefficiencies or people that aren't needed for the task at hand. They're turning loose. We're told, there's no paper on this, it's just anecdote. We're told they're turning loose something called an agent. Artificial intelligence has agents. That is, you assign a task to an algorithm and you turn it loose and then it comes back with results. Those agents are identifying tens of thousands of jobs that are not needed for an efficient government. There is protest from the people who are no longer to be efficient, but there's protest from political voices as well. Germanicus, I'll stop there and come to the puzzle. Mr. Trump campaigned on this. Mr. Musk very clearly during the campaign and now since then has been breezily voluble about what he's doing. There's no secret going on. These are young people, 19, 20, 24, who are going from building to building and have access to the records and say, we don't need this, we don't need that. And that is up to the president. And my understanding from talking to a colleague of mine, Richard Epstein, is that the executive branch has limits, but not about the Department of Commerce, not about the Department of Education, not about the Justice Department. Those departments are under the executive branch. It's the president's choice to keep them or not keep them. It's not Congress, and it's not the judiciary. So, Germanicus, the country voted for this. Is Washington listening?
What Washington's trying to do as an old, comfortable ruling establishment is to stop this and to stop it by creating a kind of straw man to serve as a misdirection, so that this is all about Trump coming in like Marius to purge his enemies and to extract revenge for all of the indignities and assaults that he's suffered over the years from them at their hand. And there's some measure of that, but there's also an overriding crisis, and it's not a constitutional crisis. It's a crisis of government in the broadest sense of what government is, and government is the steward of the economy and of the society, and it is now driving an economic crisis in the future because we have a debt that is what, $36 trillion, and it has to be dealt with. And if it is not dealt with, there will be the kind of crises that nations have suffered that have brought them to revolution. And I think the French Revolution is a great example because the debts that the French state had allowed to stack up as a result of the American Revolution and French support for that revolution and the wars came to some enormous sum for those days, 500 million livres. And that debt, the French had no way to deal with it, and it pushed the society over the edge. And we don't want to come to that precipice. And it is coming to a head, and it probably will come to a head during Mr. Trump's second term. And therefore, this is all necessary. We're well beyond the prophylactic stage. This is now a furious kind of effort to try and stave off an impending disaster. And effectively, Congress has ceased to exercise its authority in the area which it is supposed to be dominant. It's supposed to be, the legislature is supposed to appropriate the money. And it has done that, but it has not served to restrain spending. And that this is, something has to be done. And you're quite correct in the sense that there are all sorts of areas and ways in which the president can either trim the workforce, the federal workforce, or decide not to spend certain funds. And that can bring down the burden. I'm not sure how much, but it ultimately, major cuts are going to have to be made across the board, including defense. So this whole business that Blue had been pursuing of, well, we have to be ready to fight a war with China, and so we need to defeat Russia first, and then there's always Iran. And this was the whole Biden administration, was this kind of talk. That really needs to end so that we can bring down the size of government to keep the U.S. from going bankrupt.
Not only bankrupt, but the election matters a deal here. Mr. Trump was very clear that he was going to turn Musk loose with DOGE.
Yes.
Very clear.
Yes.
Everybody who voted for Mr. Trump knew that. Everybody who voted against him knew that.
Mm-hmm. Well, he has authority now because 70% of Americans support what he's doing now. Not, oh, they support him, I voted for him, but 70% support his efforts to do this.
In addition, what you say about money, but it's also about authority. The executive branch is a separate branch of government. When bills are advanced, Congress can initiate a bill and the president must approve it. Or the president can initiate a bill and Congress must approve it. It's a dialogue. It's not one is superior to the other. The courts weigh in on constitutional matters, and I guess that's what the rhetoric is now.
Yeah.
But in talking to Richard Epstein, the only limit that he could identify that's in a gray zone is the boards, the independent boards that are part of the executive branch. The National Labor Relations Board. In 1935, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, this is his first term, wanted to fire one of the members of the NLRB before his 7-year term was up. And that led to a clash between the courts and the president. That is not, unless for cause, that is a reason you can fire, but not because you want to make room for one of yours.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's the limit of an executive. Other than that, all of this is in train. So we'll leave this matter just by saying I think that there's more hot air going on in Washington than usual. You live in and around Washington. Is everybody excited momentarily and they'll calm down, or is this a sea change for them?
For the ruling elite, it's a sea change, and their way of life has to change. And the fact that his popular support is so high in the pursuit of this goal to shrink the burden of government means that, in effect, the more that you see Blue decrying his desire to shrink government and to save money, the more support he gets. And so, in a sense, they're weakening themselves. They're continuing to weaken themselves in the same way that they unwittingly did before the election. They couldn't conceive that the path they had chosen was going to hurt them, and they can't right now. They can't come to terms with the fact that the stance they're taking is is not wanted by Americans. They don't support that. Profligacy is not in fashion now among Americans.
Quickly, I am Germanicus and Gaius are here to debate something that happened at the end of the 4th century CE, AD, and the beginning of the 5th century, right before Rome was sacked for the first time. Okay, by the Goths. It has to do with an emperor, Germanicus knows him well. This is what, 200 years, 300 years in from now. We're in 91 AD. We're very comfortable and very secure, but the empire at the end of the 4th century was not. And Theodosius was the unified emperor, the last of the emperors ever, similar to the Claudian or Vespasian or
Right.
clans, the last of them, because his two sons, Honorius and I can never remember the other.
Arcadius.
Arcadius, thank you. Arcadius gets the east, Honorius gets the west. Honorius is a simpleton, and that invites the strong hand of a man named Stilicho after he got rid of a man named Rufinus. Why I bring this up is because the division of the empire into east and west turned out to be a wise decision. The east lasted another 1,100 years and still there today. The west went through a bad patch. That'd be a fair way to say it, Germanicus, a bad patch. Because the west did not have good leadership. It had a man named Stilicho. The reason I bring all this up is because we're watching the emperor, Mr. Trump, surrounded by men who are very strong-minded. Mr. Musk is one, Mr. Vance is one. We've talked of them today. There are other names, lots of other names. And all of them are rivals for attention of the emperor, reminding me of this period between 395 and 408 when Rome was sacked. What do we learn from this, Germanicus? What are the lessons that we can watch for in Washington as the emperor is aided by his strong-minded men, but there's always the concern that they want more than just being the emperor's lieutenant, that they want the crown itself.
We might be, the two of us might be criticized for comparing our empire to that of the United States, or indeed to call the United States an empire at all, and especially to refer to the American president as an emperor. But in truth, if you look at the dynamics of running an empire, the way in which America is run and the way it has to be run, and the reliance on a very strong leader is no different from that of Rome, whether you look at Augustan Rome or Theodosian Rome in the late period. And if you don't have a strong leader, you're in a very difficult position because not only do you have several people, jockeying for power and think that they are the one, and shall I make my move now? Why not? And then you have civil wars, as you did in Rome, or in the US, you have a coming apart of authority, as you did in the period of the last emperor, Tiberius, I mean, Mr. Biden, this is something that can't be sustained. And Stilicho was the effective emperor in the West. And he had three fronts to deal with. He had to deal with endless barbarian incursions, and he dealt with most of them with remarkable skill and generalship. But he also had Roman governors who decided to declare themselves emperor. He had a revolt in Africa. He had another one in Gaul, and finally there was the other empire, the so-called Eastern Empire, and he had issues there uh, with Rufinus, who was the Magister Militum of the East, and refused to coordinate. And thus Alaric got away, the Visigoth, and put the Western Empire into a critical situation for about 10 years. So, what happens in an empire is that absent a strong leader and a strong group of capable subordinates around him, that is that you not only lose the control over your distant provinces and the other realms of the empire, but things begin to fall apart at home as well. And one of the perverse elements of 5th century Roman politics was that the emperor, the weak emperor, in this case Honorius, but then later on Valentinian III, decided they had to murder the one man who was capable of defending the empire in each case. And it's not exactly that way right now in the U.S. because you have a much more robust
Right.
system, like Rome at its height. But the fact is that to have an elite that seeks to bring down a strong emperor is a recipe for potential disaster. And that's always the worry that one has in times like this. So,
And and Europe. Europe is feeding chickens. We have to let it
yeah,
go.
well, Europe is a liability now. It's not a liability in the sense that it's necessarily a strategic liability because Europe isn't threatened in spite of their bleating about Russia. There's no problem. They are a threat because they are in alliance with the elites in the US, the ruling establishment that wants to overthrow the emperor. So they are not helping. And in fact, they are in league with vociferous forces politically within the US. It's not essential that an emperor be supported by all the senators, for example, but there has to be some recognition of the emperor's legitimacy. And the main effort, this goes back to 2016 and after, all the way up to today, the main effort of the senatorial class has been to bring down the emperor. And that's not only divisive, it can put the country in a parlous position.
One question, Germanicus, because we both live with irony, being able to see 20 centuries ahead. It bothers me that a defense minister for the Republic of Germany speaks poorly of the Vice President of the United States. Am I wrong to be bothered by that?
The the only appropriate response, and I can't imagine that you disagree, is to say, to hell with you, um, Herr Pistorius. These this is not in effect it's cutting the cord, the cords that bind. And once you've cut those cords, they're very hard to restitch. And I can't imagine that they will be. In fact, the way in which European leaders have been acting, with the possible exception of um, the leader of Italy, Georgia, is that they are, or Mr. Orban, for example. I mean, most of the European leaders are behaving in ways that are basically signaling that the relationship with us is over. And I don't see what's wrong with that. But they have to come to terms with what they're actually doing. And I don't think that's sunk in yet.
The response, Herr Pistorius, is nuts.
I'm nuts. That's right. We all know that the general in Bastogne did not say nuts, but that's fine. I think it's kind of true.
I go along with the decision the editors made in 1945.
Well, I do too, frankly. That's something we've lost.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're off to the theater. We'll let you know what we see because they didn't give us a heads up. They want to make money. And I guess it'll be a surprise. We can hope for a Roman farce. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor.